Another story from Tanith Lee's The Princess Hynchatti and Some Other Surprises. Princess Cleofern. There's the picture. Princess Cleofern slept in a golden bed and had an eiderdown stuffed with swan's feathers. One night she dreamed of a handsome young man who rode up to the castle door and asked her for her hand in marriage. When she woke up in the morning, she couldn't remember what the young man looked like, or anything about him, except that he was just the sort of person she had always wanted to marry. I must leave the castle, she said to herself, and search for him. I'm certain I shall know who it is the moment I see him. When she went down to breakfast, she had already packed her bag and put on her cloak and gloves. "Are you going somewhere, my dear?" asked her father, who was the king. He was toasting slices of bread on the end of his scepter. "I had such a lovely dream," said Princess Cleofern. "I dreamed about the man I'm going to marry." "How nice," said the king, feeling rather anxious. "Yes," agreed Cleofern, "and as soon as I've finished my breakfast, I'm going out to find him." "Oh dear," murmured the king. Princess Cleofern spooned molasses into her porridge. "Perhaps," said the king, "it might be better to wait a while, at least until it stops raining." "I don't think so," said Cleofern, but she put on her galoshes. "As a matter of fact," the king told her, "there's a very nice prince who arrived only last night, and when he comes down to breakfast, I really think you might like him." "No, thank you," said Cleofern politely, and with enormous dignity. "I know who the right man is, and I'm going to find him." "Oh well," said the king, "if you really think you should," and he spread marmalade on his toast, lifted the cat off his throne, and sat down. "Just as I was getting comfortable," said the cat. By the time Princess Cleofern had crossed the drawbridge, the sun had come out and the rain was drying. Cleofern walked down the road from the castle, and before long she reached a big green wood and went in. She hadn't gone very far when she came across a band of robbers giving their horses a drink at a stream. Cleofern didn't believe in wasting time, so she went up to the robber chief, who looked very fierce and had a big knife stuck in his belt. "Excuse me," said Princess Cleofern, "could you tell me if you are the man I'm going to marry?" Well, the robber chief was rather surprised, but he saw how rich Cleofern's clothes were, and he thought to himself he could earn a lot of money if he sold her in the town as a servant. And so he said, "I'm not the man, but I can tell you who and where he is." "Can you?" asked Cleofern excitedly. "Oh yes," said the robber, "and if you're such a nice young lady, I'll take you to him myself." "Well, that is kind," said Cleofern, but she was rather afraid that one of the horses might bite her. They didn't look very friendly. As soon as they arrived in town, the robbers took Cleofern to the marketplace and sold her to a merchant. "So make a fine maid for my daughter," thought the merchant as he pulled Cleofern along by the hand. "Oh, wait," panted Cleofern. "What is it?" grumbled the merchant, stopping. "Please, would you tell me if you are the man I'm going to marry?" asked Cleofern, although secretly she hoped he wasn't. He was quite old and very fat. "Of course not," said the merchant angrily. "What nonsense!" "Perhaps it's his son," thought Cleofern as he dragged her up the street. The merchant, however, didn't have a son. He had a fat, lazy daughter who spent all day eating chocolates and all night driving up and down in her carriage, holding a big fan. "So you're my maid, are you?" she demanded. "Well, I hope you like hard work." And all day long she had Cleofern sewing and dusting, or running up and down stairs, bringing her sweets and jewels, combing her hair and fanning her, and whenever Cleofern did anything wrong, which happened quite often, the merchant's daughter would hit her or throw something at her. "I don't like this at all," Cleofern said to herself as she ducked a flying hairbrush. "Not one little bit." When it got dark, she crept down the stairs and out the back door. The sky was full of stars, and she didn't think she would need a lantern. She wandered along the streets of the town, and at last she came to the fields that lay beyond the houses. Unfortunately, a bad-tempered old giant was sitting in one of the fields, wondering whether or not to go into town and give everybody a fright. The houses were about as high as his knee, and when he leaned over them and blew, all the roofs fell off. Suddenly he felt something walking along his left leg. "What a steep hill this is," complained Cleofern, as she tripped over the giant's suspenders and fell into his pocket. "Grrr!" growled the giant, and he poked into the pocket and pulled out Cleofern between his thumb and forefinger. "Oh my goodness," thought Cleofern, struggling and wriggling. "He can't be the one." But she plucked up the courage and asked, "Excuse me, but are you the man I'm going to marry?" Well, the giant roared with laughter, and 3 or 4 trees fell over. "Oh, but," began Cleofern, as he dropped her back into his pocket on top of some rather sticky giant sweets. "I only meant," she added as he strode off across the fields. "Help!" shrieked Cleofern, realizing at last that things weren't going as well as they might. "Help! Help!" When the giant got home, his wife opened the door and scowled at him. "Whatever's making all that noise?" she demanded. And the giant took out Cleofern and put her on the table. Cleofern looked around her in horror. The table was laid for the giant's supper with a huge bowl of soup and a huge spoon to eat it with. There was a loaf as big as a bed, and a cheese as big as a staircase, and a jelly that would keep shaking from side to side. "What a nasty-looking little thing," remarked the giant's wife. "What did you want to bring that home for?" The giant stretched out his hand to take Cleofern back, but she ran and hid behind the cheese. "Now see what you've done," cried the giant's wife as he groped behind the cheese plate. Cleofern ran out and scooped up 2 handfuls of jelly, which she threw at the giant. Next, she managed to push the loaf off of the table and onto the floor, and while they were bending underneath to pick it up, she slid down the table leg and fled out the door. At first, Cleofern thought she was running through a forest, and then she realized it was the giant's flower bed, and the flowers were 10 feet tall. Then she thought she was still running through the flower bed and found it was a forest, with ordinary trees full of sleepy birds who kept shouting at her for waking them up. Eventually she came to a cottage and knocked on the door. The woman came out and looked at her angrily. "What do you want at this time of night?" she asked. "I'm looking for the man I'm going to marry," Cleofern said humbly. "I dreamed about him, you see, and I know I shall know him the moment I see him, only I can't quite remember what he looks like, as a matter of fact." The woman considered this, and after a bit she thought that Cleofern would do very well for her brother Bumble. Bumble was rather ugly and very lazy, but he had learned a little magic once and owned an enchanted stew pot that was always full of stew. "I know just the man for you," said Bumble's sister, and pulled Cleofern inside. Bumble was sitting in a chair by the fire, watching the stew pot. "I've a young lady here," said Bumble's sister. "Says that you're just the man she'd like to marry." "Oh, I only said," began Cleofern uneasily. "Oh, she'll do," Bumble cut in shortly. "But you'll have to make herself useful. You see that stew pot?" Cleofern nodded, wisely keeping silent. "Well, it fills itself up with stew, and every hour somebody has to ladle the stew out, or it spills out and keeps on spilling. Well, you can stay and watch the stew pot, and I'll be off to bed." So saying, he and his sister went off to their bedrooms and left poor Cleofern alone with the stew. For a long time, Cleofern sat and watched the pot and listened to Bumble and his sister snoring. Every so often, she would jump up and ladle some of the stew out, just to be on the safe side. But she was very tired. Soon she could hardly keep her eyes open. "I'll just shut them for a minute," Cleofern said to herself, and the next minute she was fast asleep. When she woke up, the sun was rising and the room was full of stew. The fire had long since gone out, and now the chair and the cauldron and the table and the cupboard were all floating in a sea of hot broth, full of carrots and turnips and potatoes. "Oh, what shall I do?" Cleofern wondered. Just then she heard Bumble waking up, and she decided. She swam to the door, pushed it open, and fell out into the forest, leaving the stew splashing and Bumble and his sister shouting not too far behind her. In the finish, the noise died away, and Cleofern found herself on the long road leading out of the wood and to a grand castle. "Oh," said Cleofern, quite surprised. "Oh, that's where I live." And when she got to the drawbridge and went in through the front door, she had never been so glad to be anywhere. She saw the king in the breakfast room, toasting bread on his scepter, as usual. The cat was fast asleep on his throne. "Ah, Cleofern," said the king, "you're just in time for breakfast. Did you find the young man you dreamed about?" Cleofern sat down and ate her porridge hungrily. "I'm afraid not," she said. "Really, I don't think I ever will, because people never seem to mean what they say to one." "Ah, my dear," said the king, "that's the worst of the world." "I suppose," said Cleofern, "that the prince who came to visit us has gone home by now. He really must have thought I was very rude." "Oh, not at all," said the king. "He'll be down any moment." "Well," said Cleofern, "I don't think I've any right to refuse him, if he decides he'd like to ask for my hand. I'm so silly. I don't imagine I'll ever find the husband I wanted." Somebody knocked on the door. "Well, that must be the prince," said the king. And it was. "Good morning," said the prince, gazing at Cleofern and thinking she was just perfect for him in every way. "I am so glad to meet you at last." But Cleofern was completely speechless, because, of course, the prince was the young man she had dreamed of, and he had been waiting here at the castle all the time. The end.